So before the earthquakes and since the earthquakes, there's a lot of properties that are at risk of flooding from the Ōtākaro Avon River. And it got worse because of the earthquakes, because a lot of the land went down somewhat, and the river got a little bit narrower as well. And of course, with climate change and sea level rise, it's going to get worse over time. So flood risk is a real thing here to deal with the planning for the Ōtākaro Avon River Corridor. So what happens with the lower part of the Avon River is that although rainfall is a really important factor, the most dominating factor is actually the sea level and the tide. And so the tide comes into the estuary and up the river, and that really controls the water level in the river, along with some extra water coming down from the big events. But it's mainly about the tidal reaches, which is why some solutions are going to work better than others in terms of helping resolve those risks. So to protect houses from flooding, we need to think about how it happens. So because the water level goes up and down with the tide, and it's pretty much tidal dominated all the way up to Swans Road, and it's mostly tidally dominated all the way up to Barbados Street. And it's going to get a little bit more tidally dominated with climate change. We've got to think about the best ways to deal with those risks and protect houses. So what are our options? There's been studies done on tidal barriers and also at stop banks and at pump stations and so on. And what that is all telling us is that stop banks is probably going to be the best way to protect all the existing red zone, but also more importantly, the existing properties in the green zone from flooding. So those stop banks, like the one I'm standing on now, that it goes the whole length of the river and provides a barrier for water not to get out of the river over to properties. And we can place those either right beside the river here or further away. And of course, they're more expensive here, they're cheaper further away, but it doesn't mean that we can do things for some things in between the stop bank and the river. So the location of where we're going to put the stop banks is a really important thing to think about. Because the river is tidally dominated, it's like a big bathtub. So creating other big holes like ponds or lakes or detention basins isn't actually going to help the flood risk very much. What it can do though is help treat the stormwater that's running off the roads and the roofs and the gardens further out before it gets into the river. So there's a water quality advantage to small detention basins, but large ones isn't actually going to make a big difference for flood risk. So that's why the solution that's most likely to be used is around stop banks rather than detention basins. Yeah, well, a stop bank is raising the level of the ground. So a stop bank could be 2 metres wide, kind of like the one that I'm standing on here now, or it could be 100 metres wide, which is really just raising the land. And then of course, if you raise the land enough, you can put that land above flood level. Now I know there's, from a technical point of view, it's possible to do that and then put houses on there to be able to protect them from flooding. There's a whole lot of other discussion about what's the right thing to do in terms of residential development. But from a technical point of view, by filling the land, it can basically provide a stop bank, a very wide stop bank, and allow other things to happen on the land. So as we're thinking about the best way to protect from flood risk, we also got to think about what happens to the water that lands further out from the river and drains to the river through either pipes or over overland flow paths along roads and things like that. We need to make sure it gets back into the river at some stage. So that means if we're raising the land with stop banks or any other way, we need to provide that flow path and potentially pump stations to lift it up into the higher water level in the river. Plus we also need to think about stormwater treatment and all the other opportunities that can provide. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, stop banks like the one I'm standing on, they're very useful, but they're not the most attractive thing in the world. So we need to think about how we can integrate stop banks and flood protection with all the other ideas and land uses that we might have. So this is our challenge.